I think that the point that I make about the current state of atheism is that it's disappointing at the intellectual level. That is, that there have been prior generations of early modern atheists, but that they were still, two things. One, grounded in a tradition that they somewhat understood. That is, Nietzsche, for instance, in the 19th century, his father was a pastor. He had grown up in a very pious household. So when he rejected what he understood as the faith he was raised with, it was a rejection that was not colored by total ignorance of either the experience of faith or the object of faith. When you read someone like Richard Dawkins today, or A.C. Grayling, or Daniel Dennett, the first thing that strikes you is just the profound ignorance. At the philosophical level, they're addressing a picture of God that isn't even one endorsed either by Christianity or any major theistic tradition at all. I mean, you can step outside of Christianity and still find that this picture of God is a more caricature than anything else. But also that you get these rather banal characterizations of what faith consists in, what the passion of faith is. Now, in part, Christianity has done this to itself, or not just in part, to a very great degree. I think that the atheist picture of God that someone like Dennett rejects is simply an inversion of a kind of either fundamentalist picture or intellectually inadequate picture of God that's been incubated within within confessionally Christian circles over the years. It's not as if it's not as if this sort of disbelief has not been invited by certain supposed advocates of faith. But it is strange. We have reached a moment in history when secularism is well enough established in Western culture that atheists can start from a totally fabulous picture of belief. It's as if they're talking about unicorns or dragons rather than about anything that a person who actually believes would understand as his or her faith.
Back from our break, and we're ready to jump into a very philosophical conversation with David Bentley Hart. Now, you've hinted at this in what you've just said, but one of the ways in which popular atheism dismisses the Christian God is by this very common move, an instinct, or really a default instinct, to categorize, say, the Christian storyline or the Bible storyline along with just every other fairy tale. You say at one point, I believe, it really what this comes down to is this assumption that one could say, well, I believe neither in God nor in the fairies at the bottom of my garden, as you yourself say in one of your books.
Yeah.
But you've pushed back against this assumption, first and foremost, because you've said, well, fundamentally this is a category mistake. And
well, I mean, there you have a perfect indication of how poorly the sort of popular atheist movement grasps what's at stake traditionally when people talk about God, especially if they mean to take on the intellectual tradition of Christianity or Judaism or what have you. And obviously, I mean, I think quite often when they try to, as Richard Dawkins rather touchingly maladroit attempts to argue against Thomas Aquinas, which is, I think, rather like watching a dolphin trying to tap dance. You realize just how utterly unacquainted they are with the terms of the debate. And that's a perfect example. The person I was quoting there actually was A.C. Grayling, who is putatively a trained philosopher. though he's more of a newspaper columnist with a philosophical degree these days. But it shows you that he's unable to make a simple distinction between kind of, well, in philosophy, what we call modal claims being made. If there are fairies, or if there are gods, Zeus or Wotan, or Wotan rather, or whoever you will, as usually conceived, they would be beings within nature. And the only sort of claims one would make for their existence is that you're acquainted with them, or that you've heard about them, or that you know something about their mysteries and how they've revealed themselves. So, but really, the only way you could establish whether or not Zeus exists is it'd be something analogous to a scientific investigation to see whether a certain species of butterfly could be discovered. You'd have to go looking. It's an empirical question. Now, you would think someone like A.C. Grayling would look at the history of theistic thought and notice that those are not the kind of arguments being made about God. That the arguments that are being made about God are not about a discrete, finite being within the fold of nature. We have an empirical knowledge in the way we would of a tree or some other object, but rather they're making logical arguments, and arguments about logical necessity and about modal contingency and about the conditions of the existence of anything. And if those are the arguments being made, then obviously we're in a completely different category of claims. We're not talking about an object who's available only to empirical investigation. In fact, we're talking about a truth that's available to reason. And that means that we're not talking about anything within the same continuum. But in any event, but when all these traditions talk about God, they're talking about the ground of all reality, the source of all being, the beginning and end of all things, the logically necessary terminus of thought when it seeks to find the conditions for the existence of anything that does exist. And it just strikes me as odd that someone like Grayling, who should be acquainted simply with classical texts, could be so utterly ignorant of the difference in the difference in modal vocabulary and difference in philosophical category, that he could say something like that. And yeah, unfortunately, it's typical of the entire current generation of atheist proselytizers.
Do you think someone like Grayling, or it doesn't even have to be him, it could be, as you've just mentioned, some of his disciples or contemporaries, friends, yep. Yes. Do you think that this type of caricature, I mean, is this just due to the fact that they look at, say, the miracles throughout Scripture, and they just think, well, that's fantastic, that's impossible, that's something of the storybooks, and so they just assume that this is just the God of these miracles is just the same category as say, the Greek gods?
Well, I mean, even the Greek gods weren't real. I mean, look, I mean, there are mythical characterizations of God in the Bible as well. I mean, that's simply the fact. I mean, I'm not a fundamentalist, so let me be clear about this. The revelation of God is a progressive reality in the history of Israel and the church, and so there are plenty of passages that you could read that way, but later Jewish and Christian tradition both interpreted them as images with a deeper meaning. But I don't think. I mean, I think you're overestimating the degree of hermeneutical sophistication here. I mean, someone like A.C. Grayling probably is scarcely aware of the stories, let alone the intellectual tradition that made sense of them for Christians. I think for him, any claim about God is, whether it's Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or anything else, it's all going to be the same thing. It's going to be of a piece with a polytheistic picture of some finite being who's sort of psychological individual who makes the world in the way that a mechanic makes a car or a sculptor makes a statue, as if, dealing, and much of their understanding, remember, things like the doctrine of creation, don't actually come from the Christian intellectual tradition. They come from a later deistic understanding of God as the creator and superintendent of an essentially mechanistic universe that's extrinsic to him, and he's just some sort of very large, very capable, very resourceful technician. So part of what they're reacting to is a picture of God that was created in early modernity as an alternative to the classical theistic picture, which they have ineptly confused with the classical theistic picture.